Welcome to this week's episode of the Jewish Diaspora Report. On this week's episode, we talk about the Palestinian Loophole. Let's get started. There's a topic that I've been hoping to do since pretty much the beginning of this podcast, but I really haven't had an ability to talk about it until this episode because of some of the questions that came up in our last episode. I'm really thankful that the last episode kind of gave me a reason to talk about this, but also current events as always. So on this episode, I want to talk a little bit about what I've been calling for a very long time, the Palestinian Loophole, sometimes also known as the Muslim Loophole. In our last podcast, we talked a little bit about the fact that Israel is held to a very different standard. In an example that I gave last episode, I talked about how Israel, for some reason, is the only country in the world that has to make peace deals and ceasefires and give a state to a recognized terrorist organization. Could you really imagine during the time that ISIS was running wild in Iraq, that the Americans and the allies and anybody who was fighting the ISIS terrorists would have said, let's have a ceasefire, let's sit them down and we'll talk about how we can cut Iraq in half and give a little bit to the terrorists and a little bit to the people who want to be free, and we'll partition the land. That has never been a thing, period. And yet, for some reason, Israel is expected to do that exact thing. And this is what I call, essentially, the Palestinian loophole, whereas anything that technically is wrong or shouldn't be done or isn't done by any other country, somehow, when the Palestinian Arabs are involved, it becomes okay to do, it becomes what we need to do, it becomes the supposedly moral and righteous thing to do, and it makes no sense. It makes no common sense, anyway. In this episode, I don't think I'm going to be saying anything that's going to be revolutionary or something that seems crazy and far-fetched. This stuff on its face is pretty obvious if you've looked for it. And the most obvious way we can see it is in terrorism. Terrorism all around the world is bad. We've all accepted that. We've all agreed with that. And most notably, right now is a perfect example because, as most of you probably have heard, the recent concert in Vienna by Taylor Swift had incidents of terrorism, and everybody was against it. How dare these poor people be targeted for terror by an ISIS-inspired group of people? This is awful. We need to cancel everything and call it out. That is a common sense and rational idea. But then when we replace the word Taylor Swift concert with Streets of Jerusalem and ISIS-inspired terrorists to Palestinian Arab from the West Bank, and all of a sudden it's a gray area. Like, I don't know, is it wrong? Is it right? Can I justify it? We have all seen the media bend over backwards to take that incident of a Palestinian Arab terrorist stabbing or shooting or whatever in Jerusalem and turning the headline into Palestinian killed by Israeli forces. And that's it. No mention of the stabbing, no mention of the terrorism. It's simply that this poor Palestinian Arab has been killed by the IDF for no reason, apparently. I didn't see any newspapers coming out saying that poor ISIS fighters detained illegally by Viennese police for simply wanting to visit a Taylor Swift concert. This is literally the definition of the Palestinian loophole in action, whereas anywhere in the world doing anything like terrorism or hate, it is wrong. But if it's done either by or in support of the Palestinian Arabs, apparently it's fine. That is the Palestinian loophole. We also saw it on huge display when it came to protests and encampments. Whereas right now in the UK, not that I'm condoning any type of violence, we have right-wing violence against the Muslim community of the UK and Muslim violence against everybody else in the UK. And for some reason, it seems like the one side is being treated differently than the other side. In a recent post on YouTube and on Instagram by Joseph Cohen, founder of the Israel Advocacy Movement from the UK, he showed videos of both pro-Palestinian riots against police and civilians and the anti-Muslim riots by the far right in UK. And you can see that there's very similar situations, except for the fact that in one, they are waving Palestinian flags while they beat police officers. Following showing you the comparison between both of these situations, he showed the reaction by the politicians in the UK. One was an outright call against the far right doing these kind of actions, saying it's inappropriate, it is not something that should be happening in the UK, and it should be condemned wholeheartedly. And the other was silence. There was no press conference calling out the violence in the streets against police and against civilians of the UK. Dead silence. Because as long as you're waving the right Palestinian flag, apparently threatening and attacking local people is totally fine. But when people on the right, who are attacking people on the left, without those flags, it is seen as completely inappropriate for a civilized world. In one of the most horrific, terrible things that we have seen is the justifying of rape when it comes to October 7th. I've talked about it endlessly on here. Many of you already know about it. It's not a surprise. But what was more crazy was in the news recently, if you've been keeping up with this, there's been somewhat of a scandal, let's call it, on the left. This includes Israeli left newspapers who broke the story, claiming that there is a video showing Israeli soldiers in a detention center, an Israeli jail, for Hamas terrorists sexually assaulting an inmate, a Hamas terrorist. And it hit the news with a firestorm. The Palestinian Arab social media went crazy with this story. The problem that I pointed out on our Instagram this week is the fact that it's interesting how many people literally justify and deny rapes that happened on October 7th, despite all of the evidence, medical, eyewitness testimony, so on, will not accept it. It didn't happen. Where's the proof? Blah, blah, blah. Meanwhile, apparently, a Hamas member in prison was sexually assaulted, and we accept it on face value, 100% accurate, 100% true. Believe them all, they say. This is the Palestinian loophole on steroids, essentially. On the one hand, you have proof, evidence, facts of actual sexual violence, finally after far too long being acknowledged by the UN, and theories suggesting that certain things happened and a video shows people being molested in a jail, and that's more than enough to be concrete evidence to bring forward. Unfortunately for them, for anyone who's actually seen the video, someone very astutely online pointed out that if you look at this supposed video that shows this sexual violence against a prisoner, you can see that the date on the video was completely manipulated, where it starts on Tuesday at 2 o'clock. You see a bunch of Israeli guards picking up this Palestinian Arab terrorist and taking him off the screen. And then all of a sudden it cuts to Friday, a completely different day, different time, where these people are behind some sort of shield in order to search this person for contraband. And they put two things together. It's grainy, it's blurry. No one really knows what's happening behind that set of shields that are blocking the person from the camera. And they take this as pure evidence that it happened. Unfortunately for the people who actually listen to facts and truth, the hospital and the doctors who looked at this gentleman after claiming he had been sexually assaulted, turns out that he actually jammed a cell phone up his rear end by himself in order to smuggle it into the prison, and that caused the damage that he claimed was the Israelis sexually assaulting him. Now, I'm assuming that the Israelis somehow had to get the phone out of there. It might have done some damage, but it wasn't sexual violence. It was himself trying to smuggle contraband into a jail. But it's the Palestinian loophole. As long as he's Palestinian and he's an Arab, we will accept anything they say at face value without any questions or scrutiny, whereas I need proof of October 7th actually happening. Do you not have a video showing exactly what happened in the exact way that I want to see it? And if it's not from the same source or the proper source, I won't accept it. Rape is not bad unless you're a Palestinian Arab or a Palestinian Arab supporter. Or more succinctly put, me too, unless you're a Jew. But in one of the most ridiculous forms of the Palestinian loophole, the way that the countries around the world have been silent on the fact that their own civilians and citizens have been kidnapped by a Palestinian terrorist group is sadly mind-blowing. I don't understand how they justify hands off, not our problem, if it's done by Palestinian Arabs. If we think about the recent past, it wasn't that long ago that the United States made a deal with Russia to get a number of their hostages out of prisons that were illegally put into prisons, according to the Americans. The U.S. agreed to broker a deal with Russia that would get 4 American hostages back in return for 8 Russian prisoners. Now, I'm no mathematician here, but that seems to be a 2-to-1 ratio. You know, some people like to say, was it a good deal? Is it a bad deal? Whatever. I'm not going to get into that politically. But the fact is that the United States did broker a deal with another country for hostages to get their American people back. Period. Pretty simple. It's kind of what we expect the State Department to do if kidnapped by a rogue nation. On the other hand, you have 8 American hostages currently in Hamas captivity, and the Americans have been essentially silent on the entire thing. I know that one party likes to talk about it as a political thing. Another party maybe pays lip service to it. I really don't like getting into politics. But let's just say that there is absolutely no effort by the Americans to get these people out. Period. And this same thing goes for Canadians and many other countries. At the same time, the Americans are suggesting to the Israelis and trying to broker a deal with them hostages for ceasefire. Okay, fair. Maybe that is a nice thing to do. Get the Americans back, sure. But unlike when they do a negotiation for their people and it's a 2-to-1 ratio, for some reason, when it's Palestinian terrorists, it is a 50-to-1 ratio. And this has gone back historically. Whenever the United States is brokering a deal between Hamas and Israel, for some reason, it's 50-to-1 ratio, where we let out 50 terrorists for 1 Jewish life. I don't know why this seems fair when an American life apparently is only worth 2 Russian lives, but apparently is worth 50 Palestinian lives. We can clearly see the Palestinian loophole in action, specifically when it comes to hostages. They left them to fend for themselves. There is no attempt by the U.S. Embassy to get to the hostages, to find them, to make sure they're okay, to demand Hamas brings them back. And again, I'm not just picking on the United States here. This is every single Western nation who has said nothing, including Canada, by the way. And when they try to broker a deal, for some reason, Palestinian Arab lives are worth so much more than Jewish lives, let alone American lives, that we give up 50 terrorists for 1 life. It just goes to show how America seems to value a Jewish life, even an American Jewish life. Apparently it's worth less than the ones they got out of Russia at 2-to-1. In the beginning of this episode, I suggested that it's the Palestinian loophole, which is very much frequently the case. But it's also a Muslim loophole for some reason. In certain cases, like for example in Nigeria, where the Christian Nigerians are being slaughtered en masse and kidnapped by Islamic terrorists, and no one talks about it. Or recently, the Hindus of Bangladesh that are being completely and utterly destroyed by Islamic terrorists, and somehow the world stays silent. I'll be honest, as a Jewish person, it hurts. We are sadly far too used to being treated this way. No one caring about Jewish lives, nobody talking about us in the news when we're being slaughtered and killed and massacred and all that other stuff, justifying our deaths. That we Jews are used to. But to see it happening to another group of people, the Hindus who have not harmed anybody in Bangladesh, being killed for supposedly land and having their temples destroyed, it just really shocks us to see that it's just gone too far. And that there is this loophole where when Muslims in Syria murder 500,000 other Muslims, people stay silent. When Muslims are killing Hindus, people stay silent. When Muslims are killing Nigerians, people stay silent. But for some reason, when the Jewish people are defending themselves against Muslims, for some reason that's treated differently. They talk about genocide and this ethnic cleansing and whatever. I don't know what you can call in Bangladesh right now the fact that the Muslims of Bangladesh are murdering and killing the Hindus? Is that not ethnic cleansing? But no one's talking about it. I literally haven't seen a single mainstream media talking about this issue. And it makes me sick to my stomach to think of the fact that the Hindu people are watching a slaughter and no one's even talking about it. All while the left is crying about the ethnic cleansing and genocide of Gaza that isn't really happening. In the end, I think you can see here pretty common sense on its face, a double standard that's been going on. And no matter what happens, whatever the society decides is right or wrong, somehow seems to have a loophole whenever it is Palestinian Arabs or Palestinian supporters doing those things. Terrorism is wrong unless you're a Palestinian supporter. Rioting in the streets and attacking police officers is wrong unless you're a Palestinian Arab supporter. Murdering, kidnapping, raping is all terrible under everybody's definition, except if you're a Hamas member on October 7th, or if you are a Muslim in Bangladesh. Somehow, by some logic, we're okay with that. That is totally fine. Making Israel a country that has done nothing but try and defend itself from terror since 1948, and even earlier before it became a state, is somehow being asked, demanded, forced to let out the worst terrorists known to humankind in order to get peace with those people, and then take those terrorists and those radicalized people and give them a state right next to you, something that no country is expected to do. It's expected to give up 50 people with blood on their hands for one Jewish life. Meanwhile, every other country gets to do 1-to-2 ratios or better. The double standard could not be more clear. I know that most of you who are listening to this, probably this isn't news to you. I'm sure most of you know this, have seen this, and I guess I'm not giving you any more new factual information. But hopefully you'll understand that this might be a thing that you can bring up in the future. I like using this term Palestinian loophole because it really is the best way to summarize what's been going on. Everything that is wrong in this society apparently has one little star or asterisk beside it, a little footnote, which is unless it's done by a Palestinian Arab, a Palestinian terrorist, or one of their supporters. Conversely, you could also say that unless it's against a Jew. If it's somehow against a Jew, it is somehow different than every other people and every other country in the world. Rules do not apply. This has been another episode of the Jewish Diaspora Report. Don't forget to check us out on social media at jdr.podcast and check out some of our other episodes on your favorite podcast source. We'll see you next time.